And welcome to the Gay Liberation Network on CAN TV. I'm your host, Andy Thayer of the GLN, and with us tonight is Rosalinda of the Moratorium on Deportations campaign. We're going to be talking about so-called immigration reform, as you saw on your screen, and in a little bit we'll be taking your calls, but for just the first few moments here, we'd like you to hold your calls, but when you're ready, we're ready for you. We'll ask you to call the number on your screen there. But first, I'd like to give Rosalinda a chance to explain some of the issues here, because we're hearing a lot about this bill that passed the Senate that's being pushed by the Democrats in the House, and it's being billed as immigration reform. And as your organization has said in the past, the word reform has almost become a swear word amongst those who are truly interested in gains for people. When we hear about education reforms, it means vilifying teachers, busting unions, and closing down schools. When we hear about so-called health reform, it's often cutting mental health clinics, as we've seen 50% of the cutbacks in the city in terms of the mental health clinics. And we've been hearing a lot about so-called immigration reform, and certainly there are a number of congressional representatives who pose themselves as being for immigrant rights, who are saying this is a great thing, and then you've got what may be termed the Yahoo chorus of far-right Republicans who are opposed to it. But what do you think is in interests of immigrants, and how does this so-called reform bill fit in, Rosalinda?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that immigration reform, if we are to speak about it in a general sense, doesn't really mean much, right? It just means to reform means to change, so to change immigration policy, right? So one could say immigration reform, it could be a good thing or it could be a bad thing for immigrants. It really depends on what's the legislation that's on the table. Mm-hmm. And in the last 2 decades, every time there's been a reform or there's been the use of the term of reform to talk about policy change, it generally has meant a neoliberal kind of agenda, right? Privatizing things, pushing people out, and working against the interests of poor people. It's really the same in immigration policy right now. So people say immigration reform, it's a historic opportunity to pass immigration reform, and those words sound positive. They sound like they will finally address the needs of immigrants. They will finally address this sort of horrible deportation record that Obama has. And in actuality, it's the exact opposite. The bill that passed the Senate, which is Senate Bill H744, and is now copied almost exactly by a House Democratic initiative. This bill is expanding surveillance and enforcement against immigrants, expanding border militarization, criminalizing poverty among immigrants, and expanding the exclusions and deportability of immigrants. So it's really an enforcement and militarization bill.
Well, and it's something that your organization pointed out, Rosalinda, that I think people need to know about the so-called reform bill is that some $46 billion would be poured into so-called border security. I mean, we live in a country that is laying off people left and right due to the sequester and so forth, and there's this talk about spending more money on basically military measures for especially the U.S.-Mexico border. And I think when people hear the word reform, people are so desperate, and with good reason. I mean, President Obama has become known as the Deporter-in-Chief for very good reason. He's on track as of January of this next year to have deported more people than every president in history. Certainly the rate of deportations currently is even more than George W. Bush. And so the desperation, the countless families who are being broken up, it's got to speak to a real need when people say this is reform, but as I think you've said, we've got to look at the details of this bill and say, is this really going to help immigrants or is it going to hurt them?
Right.
Before we go any further, I would like to invite our listeners to call us on the telephone number on the bottom of your screen there, 312-738-1060, if you'd like to call in with a question or comment. Rosalinda and I will do our best. Now, Rosalinda, tell us a bit more about some of the provisions of this bill that's being pushed and who are the primary backers behind it.
Okay. Well, first of all, the bill, let's just start with the title. The bill is not called Immigration Reform. It is called the Border Security, Economic Opportunity, and Immigration Modernization Act. And it doesn't sound nearly as positive when you say its actual name. There are major sections of the bill. It's 1,200 pages, so it's impossible to summarize all the provisions. But some of the important ones are, as you've mentioned, around $46 billion would be earmarked to militarizing the U.S.-Mexico border. There would be a big push to have a national e-verify system, which means that every employer would be screening the biometrics of every employee in the country, not just folks who are non-citizens. And there is a new provisional temporary status that's being invented for immigrants that is very much like a probation, an extended probation of about 13 years. This is what's being billed as the path to citizenship, and it's being advertised as a positive thing for folks who are out of status currently. They can apply for this new status called RPI, Registered Provisional Immigrant. And they have 13 years in this status, after which potentially they can apply for a green card. What folks are not talking about very much is exactly what this status means, how many people are excluded from it, and also how people can be made deportable even while they're in this status. It's like a minefield, right? Once you apply for this status, there are many ways in which you can be denied, and there are many ways in which you can be deported simply for applying. One example would be, I'm sorry to interrupt. One example would be the provisions about income. So if your income falls below poverty lines, minimum poverty rates, which means for a family of two with one worker and one dependent, minimum wage won't cut it. So when you are applying to renew this status, if your income falls below minimum wage, you will be denied status and you will be deported. So it's a very tricky status that doesn't have any guarantees, and that, in our view, exposes people to really, really risky situations and exposes them to the risk of being deported.
Well, and one of those provisions that we've discussed on our show previously is what could be termed the three strikes you're out provision, whereas if you are found guilty of 3 misdemeanors, and anyone who's ever been arrested knows you can rack up 3 misdemeanors in just one arrest, then you are deportable. You have violated that so-called probationary situation, and it gives police officers who want to abuse their authority that much more ability to take advantage of people or employers. And that was the problem historically with the so-called Braceros program that was popular in the 1950s and 60s, where migrants came primarily from Mexico under provisional status, and if in the opinion of their employer or someone else in authority they stepped out of line, then they could be deported. And so it prevented people from forming unions and asserting their rights if they weren't being paid. And I'm sure you've heard innumerable stories, Rosalinda, of people not getting paid and with employers violating the current already bad law. So this so-called immigration reform is really fraught with peril, I think, for a lot of people. But before we continue the conversation, I do want to make a few announcements, things to keep track of coming forward. First of all, if you want to get in touch with the Gay Liberation Network, please go to our website, www.gayliberation.net. We're currently mobilizing for the big march on Springfield, about which a few words in a moment. And you can get information about that at our website. Also, I'd like to invite you to get involved with Rosalinda's organization, the Moratorium on Deportations campaign. Their website is on your screen there, moratoriumondeportations.org. Also, people may remember that the Gay Liberation Network was very involved in the organizing against NATO last year in Chicago, and there's a great film by two-time Oscar winner Haskell Wexler. It's going to have a free showing on Wednesday, October 16th at Columbia College. The information there is on the screen. It's first come, first serve. Please check that out. And one of the things that the Gay Liberation Network has been really mobilizing for quite furiously, as well as many organizations in our state, is for the big March on Springfield at the start of the fall veto session to finally, hopefully, get a vote on marriage equality in this state and marriage equality for LGBT people. And you can get more information about the program of that at the marchonspringfield.org website. But back to our discussion about immigrant rights. One thing that many people don't know is that the Democrats, and Durbin amongst them, promised that LGBTs would be included in any immigrant rights bill that came down the pike. And of course, like with so many promises, that one was broken. In fact, the writing was on the wall back in February when the National Conference of Catholic Bishops sent a so-called secret letter to President Obama saying that if there was any provisions recognizing the rights of LGBT people, for example, being able to naturalize our spouses, that the Catholic Church would oppose immigrant rights reform, and that's indeed what happened. Is that we got punted on there, and that was the first of very many betrayals that you saw as the bill was making its way through the U.S. Senate, and now we've got a horrendous bill, as Rosalinda was outlining. Rosalinda, could you say something about who are the primary backers of this current bill and why they're pushing this bill in spite of all these awful provisions that you were outlining?
The Senate bill 744 came out of a bipartisan commission, the so-called Gang of Eight. And as it evolved in the negotiations in the Senate, it received enough support to pass through the Senate by becoming more and more inflated in terms of security costs, in terms of militarization, and in terms of exclusions. So it started off as a bad bill, and then it became even worse. Currently, all the Democrats are backing the bill, and some Republicans are on board. Certainly in the Senate, there were enough Republicans on board. And in the House, a group of Democrats are now pushing for an almost identical bill. Interestingly enough, the mainstream immigrant rights movement, the big NGOs, are also promoting this bill. They're doing so in these sort of vague ways. They're asking people, come out and march for dignity for immigrants, for rights for immigrants, for reform, for keeping families together, for stopping deportations. And they're encouraging people to believe that this bill will stop deportations or increase family unity or bring justice to immigrants. They're conflating these different the desires that people have, the legitimate desires that people have, and suggesting that this bill will somehow resolve them. Large immigrant rights NGOs like Illinois Coalition for Immigrant Refugee Rights are mobilizing marches. There's one tomorrow in which they're inviting immigrant communities to come out and march for reform with dignity and respect. It's very difficult to find dignity and respect in a bill like this. However, these organizations are complicit in being deceptive and misleading people about the provisions of the bill. They have repeatedly stated in their information and in their printed and website materials that the bill will lead to legalizing 11 million people. It won't. That it will increase family unity. It won't. It will actually decrease. It will eliminate the family reunification visa program.
And if I may interrupt for a second, that's what I find so utterly disgusting about this bill. It guts family reunification, and yet the pictures of fathers and mothers being torn
Clutching
away
their
from
children.
their families is what has been used to market this bill, and yet that provision, in the interest of getting the right kind of wealthy immigrants,
Right.
is being cut. And it's like, here we are as LGBTs, and we're on the cusp of finally winning equal family rights, just to have that cut away from us because our spouses may not be wealthy enough.
Right.
Utterly disgusting. Right. But why are these organizations doing that, Rosalind? It seems so dishonest, and I'm sure they're not dumb people. What's going on with this?
They're not dumb people. They've read the bill. There are people who can understand what these provisions are and what they mean. And for the same reason that Democrats, powerful Democrats like Dick Durbin, will advertise themselves as champions of immigrants even while being one of the main authors of the bill. What people say and what the bill is actually doing are two very different things. And so there is a tremendous amount of willful deception involved. I think one of the reasons, there are many reasons, I think one of them is that the immigrant rights NGOs are embedded with the Democratic Party. The purpose isn't to empower immigrant communities or to help a grassroots immigrant rights movement flourish. The purpose is to get immigrant votes. The purpose is to keep immigrants and folks who are supporters of immigrant rights disciplined, dependent on the Democrats, well-behaved, not sort of imagining a different kind of alternative, a different kind of future. So the goal is to, what used to be autonomous social movement, what used to be powerful social movements, to wrap them up in electoral politics and convert them into the only thing politicians want, which is the vote. And I think that's the primary reason why it's not possible for politicians that are so mistrusted in communities to create the illusion of mass support for this bill. That's where the NGOs step in. The NGOs can produce people. They're the ones who can lie to people, who can deceive people, who can bring people on the street. They use the fact that they get all of these grants from the state and corporations to work on behalf of immigrant communities. They use that funding to lie to immigrants and say, come to the street and support this bill that will legalize you. So to say the exact opposite. And I think that the large corporate NGO structures within the immigrant rights movement play a very important political role. And their job, which they do very well, they're not stupid, they're very good at their job, they're highly trained people, and they're very efficient organizations. Their job is to turn the community to sell the community out to the political machine, and that's what's happening.
Well, and unfortunately, we've had an experience with that in the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgendered community, where wealthy NGOs with their executive directors making six-figure salaries are basically delivering up LGBTs to the Democrats, and what it means is that while we have certainly won any number of gains, given the popularity of LGBT rights in this country, it would be almost difficult not to win those gains, and so we have this slow dribble of LGBT rights when we could be having comprehensive rights in terms of, such as we saw in the great legislation in the mid-'60s for African Americans, where you win housing, employment, public accommodations, everything all at once. Instead, they're dribbling it out so as to keep the flow of campaign dollars and votes going. And so the Democrats know that this bill is not going to pass in terms of the so-called immigration reform. They know it's not going to pass the House, and yet they can conveniently use it to drum up funding, beat up the Republicans, and use it for another election cycle. It's very cynical.
It's amazing how many right-wing think tanks and politicians have supported this particular immigration reform bill. They like it. Arizona's governor has come out in support of this bill because it's pretty nakedly in the interest of agribusiness, big corporate employers, the military, in the interest of increasing the repression apparatus, increasing deportations, increasing detention. It's really a golden dream for somebody like the governor of Arizona, because it gives everyone at every jurisdiction across the nation the tools and the budget to really go after immigrants with impunity and to be more efficient at it. So it lays out a program that will unfold over decades. It's not a small change. It's really a reconfiguration of the repression against immigrants. And it's not moving in the direction of legalizing immigrants or increasing the rights of immigrants. It's unfortunately moving in the opposite direction.
Mm-hmm. Well, and the irony is that if indeed this bill does pass, it will be so much worse than the last so-called reform we got, the Simpson-Mazzoli bill, which certainly wasn't anything to write home about, but at least did lead to some fairly rapid legalization of at least several million immigrants. That was under I believe it was the first George Bush administration, or maybe it was Ronald Reagan administration. It took a Republican president to get something that actually did legalize millions. And I think it should be pointed out that in spite of the total gridlock in Congress today, President Obama could put a moratorium on deportations, as the name of the organization proposes, that he could say, I'm rather than ramping up and deporting people at a record rate, which he has through the course of his presidency so far, he could say, I've already deported more people than every other president combined. I can just stop it right now, and that's it. But that's not what he's doing. It's very cynical. At the same time, deporting a record number of people. At the same time, trying to get their votes by shadow boxing, you might say, for reform.
Well, it's not just getting their votes. He already got the votes for his second campaign. He got more immigrant votes than any other president-elect in history. And already at that time, he had deported more immigrants than any other president. So people ask, how is it possible that the president whose administration deported more immigrants than anyone else also gained more immigrant votes than anyone else? And I think the reason why that's possible is because of the game that the Democratic Party and the immigrant rights NGOs play to really mask the reality of their actions with rhetoric and propaganda. Obama is always talking about puppy love for immigrants and is always talking about immigrant rights, and he will pick one small subgroup like the childhood arrivals and throw a tiny little bit of discretion their way, which can be taken back in any time, the so-called deferred action program. So Obama can and the Democrats can always point to the Republicans as being the ones who are the right-wingers and being the ones who are interested in repressing immigrants, and point to themselves as being the champions. But when you look at it, the last administration since Reagan, there's been no difference. It's been a ramping up of repression against immigrants. None of them have ever turned anything back. None of them have ever put anything on the table that rolls back any of the provisions of the 1996 laws, that rolls back the mandatory detention provisions, that rolls back the militarization of the border. This is something that's been going on for a long time, and it's only ramping up.
Well, thank you very, very much, Rosalinda. It's been certainly a very informative, short program here, but I'm afraid we're at the end here. Rosalinda, a shout out about we've got the moratorium on deportations.org website, which we'll get on your screen again, but there was another website that you mentioned before the show. If you could give a shout out to our audience to find out more about these issues.
Yes, the other website is called, and you can find it from the first website, it's called whosimmigrationreform.com, and people were asking us what can we do instead of just criticizing? And so what we've been doing since May really is reading the bill, studying it, producing summaries, so materials that people can use who want to learn about the provisions of the bill, and having workshops where we get together in different community spaces. We talk about the provisions of the bill with people. We facilitate discussions, and we think that this is a small start in the direction of trying to dispel some of the myths and the propaganda around this political moment in terms of immigrant rights history, and trying to empower different communities and organizations to decide what side they're on, to decide what their response is, and to decide what they want to campaign for. And what we found every single time that we've had a workshop, and we've done, I don't know how many by now, many workshops by now, some really small and some really huge. What we found is that once we actually pull out the bill and pull out the provisions of the bill, people are more likely to question it, people are more likely to want to resist it, and people are more likely to ask, why are we being misled?
Okay, well, thank you very much, Rosalinda. We really wish we had more time. Just going to close out the program here with a few quick announcements. Again, if you want to find out more about Rosalinda's organization, the Moratorium on Deportations campaign, go to their website, moratoriumondeportations.org. And if you want to find out more about what happened during NATO last May here in Chicago, go to 4 Days in Chicago. Free screening of that film by two-time Oscar winner Haskell Wexler, again at Columbia College, first come, first serve at that showing next Wednesday. And also check out the big march on Springfield on October 22nd. Buses are going to be going from around the state. The Gay Liberation Network, we are organizing buses as well. You can simply go to our website, gayliberation.net, to get more information about how to get on the bus there. There are free tickets, there are low-cost tickets, and there are at-cost tickets. So whatever you need to do there, go to that website. And more information about the march itself can be found at the marchonspringfield.org website. And then also, we invite you to check out our next meeting, which is going to be the first Wednesday of each month, as it always is, at the Burger Park Cultural Center, Wednesday, November 6th. And also, check out our next show, which is going to be the second Friday of the new month. And you can check that out. And then finally, just a thanks to all those who made tonight's show possible.